Hello, everyone. After about 300 batches of starter shared, I figured it's about time I get behind the camera and give you all some videos so that you can hopefully understand my instructions just a little bit more. So tonight, all we're going to be doing is feeding the starter. This is probably one of the things that people find most complicated and most intimidating about the starter process. In all honesty, feeding the starter and getting it going in the first place is a giant pain, but thankfully you all should have had something looking like this, a container of already mature starter, so you get to skip that 3-week ordeal. So tonight what we're going to be doing is prepping some starter for use tomorrow morning. So that's one of the things in my recipe slash just sourdough in general that people kind of overlook is that you have to plan for it. So we prep the starter tonight so that the batch that we create has about 8 hours plus to ferment and fully develop, and then we use it tomorrow morning. If you try and do this all in one day, it's really tricky and it doesn't work out super well. It can be done if you kind of modify the ratios of everything a bit, but it's not ideal. Enough talking though, we're going to get to it. So here's my container of starter. If you guys can see the little line there, that's where the starter was at when it was first mixed. So there was no bubbles to it, no rise to it. As you can see, we've easily tripled, probably quadrupled by now. And I don't know if you can see on the camera here, but the starter had a nice little dome to it, and it's now starting to collapse. So this specific container has been in my fridge for about a week. I took it out of the fridge about 3-4 hours earlier, just so that it had time to come to room temperature and fully ferment before I start using it for tomorrow. So some keys that you want to look for, how you know your starter's kind of in need of a feeding or ready for use in the recipe. Visually, if you're just using an all-purpose unbleached white starter, like this one here, you'll see it rise up in the container, and then once it hits the peak of its feed cycle, it starts to drop back down. So I can see some residue kind of left on the sides of the container here. That's telling me that it's just started to drop back down. You want to feed it and or use it somewhere in between sort of the peak of its rise and where it gets back to its original level. So we're at the perfect timing here. I'm just going to grab my scale. So if you don't already have a scale and you're serious about sourdough, unfortunately, you're going to have to come over to the dark side and start using one. It took me a while to accept that I couldn't just do everything with cups, but it's just so much easier. It's a lot more consistent. You're able to reproduce the exact same loaf again and again. So I hate to say it, but a scale is a must. So I've got my mother starter, so we're going to call this the mother starter. And we're going to take from this and we're going to create more starter to be used in a recipe tomorrow. So here's my clean container. So zero out your scale. So I like to give my starter just a bit of a mix, knock out some of those bubbles. So this is another big reason why you want to use a scale, is that depending on how active and bubbly your starter is, 1 cup of it will look very different from one batch to the next. So when you're using a scale and when you're measuring in grams, there's no getting around. 20 grams is 20 grams. So for my recipe tomorrow, I need about 120 grams of starter. So I always like to make just a little bit more than I actually need, just because some of it will get stuck to the container, won't transfer out very well. Perfect, 20 grams right on the mark. That never happens. All right, so I'm just gonna set aside my mother for now. We're gonna come back to that later. There's more to be done there. So I've got 20 grams of mature starter in here. Zero out my scale again. And to that, I'm going to add, let's see, about 55 grams of water. So I'm using filtered water just with a Brita filter. You don't have to use distilled or anything like that. There is some chlorine in our tap water naturally, so adding the filter element just kind of reduces the chance that there'll be anything in there that could be harmful to to the bacteria that you need to grow, that produces the rise, and that you need for sourdough. So I'm just mixing up that starter in the water now, just dissolving everything. Not 100% necessary, but I find it just makes the mixing easier. And I'm just doing all of this with a plastic spatula, nothing fancy here. It's just a small batch, so you can do it right in the container that you're using. So, very liquidy starter. Zero that out again. Now I've measured everything out already just to make this video slightly less long. It's already going to be long. But I'm adding into that now another 55 grams. So, typically what I suggest to people when they're just doing a starter feeding is that they use a ratio of 1 part starter, 1 part water, 1 part flour. And the reason this is that it just keeps things easy to manage, easy to do the math on, and it'll give you a fully mature risen starter in about roughly 6 to 8 hours. Now my starter is quite active. I feed it regularly. So for me, if I were to mix tonight and have my starter ready in 6 hours, I don't really want to wake up that early to be dealing with it. So I've used a ratio of closer to 1 part starter to 2 parts water, almost 2.5 parts water, 2.5 parts flour. And what this does is it extends the amount of time that it takes for everything to ferment. So, you know, sourdough is a process, and everyone kind of has to figure out their routine and what works for them. I found that going like 1 to 2 to 2, or even 1 to 3 to 3, just gives me enough time that I can, you know, do the starter before going to bed, and I don't have to wake up at the crack of dawn to start prepping bread. Now, when I'm just doing a regular feeding, just to maintain the starter, so if in a hypothetical world I wasn't constantly eating sourdough and I wasn't going through it and baking regularly, I do recommend you feed your starter, which you're keeping in the fridge, about every week, maybe every 2 weeks. All right, so all I'm doing here, I'm just making sure there's no large clumps of flour left. It doesn't have to be perfectly smooth. It's kind of going to look a little bit grainy, a little bit sort of gritty, but you just want no huge chunks of flour left over. And I'm sorry in advance. I know, you know, for a good YouTube video, I should be using my hands a whole bunch more, jumping around, having screens and numbers and everything flashing across the screen. We're not quite there yet, but we'll get there, I'm sure. You know, leave a comment or let me know if you think that I'm missing out by not using more of my hands. Okay, so that's all I need for that. So now my starter is prepared for tomorrow morning. So I'll come back to this with my ratio of about 1 to 2.5 to 2.5. I'd say I need about 10, maybe 12 hours before it's fully at its peak. So just knock that out. You want to scrape around the sides, sort of clean up the container as best you can with your spatula, just so that you know and are able to mark a starting line. And that'll be important because you want to be able to visually track how much your starter has risen. Because if I were to come back to this tomorrow morning and my starter hadn't risen at all and it was still at the exact same line, I'd know that I'd done something wrong, and I wouldn't be able to use it in bread at that point in time. So I keep a lid on my starter. I know out there some people believe in capturing the wild yeast in the air. I don't really subscribe to that theory of sourdough. That's just me personally. I have 2 cats in my house, so I'd much rather make sure that I'm not getting cat hair in my starter than maximizing my wild yeast capturing. That's just me. So now we're going to come back to this mother starter. So this is, I think, part of what trips people up, is you've prepared your starter for your recipe, but you still have to deal with this. So I've got another bowl here. So I started off, I had about 120 grams in this container, and that's roughly what I've been giving people in these Jars, if you got from my initial batches, I was using different containers, unfortunately, so I think I might have been only giving you about 80 grams in there just because they were smaller containers. But ultimately, figure out how much starter you started with. Say that 10 times quickly. So 120 grams, I took out 20 grams, I have 100 grams left in here. I suggest that you always keep, anywhere from sort of 80 to 120 grams on hand at all times. That's just a good amount that you can build up from, and it also, that way you're not wasting a ton of flour every week if you're not baking regularly and you're just feeding it. So I want to get down to 40 grams left in here. So this is where the math comes in, and I'm not good at math myself, but I can figure out sourdough for whatever reason. So I've got 100 grams left in here. I want to get down to 40. So that means I need to take out 60 grams of starter. So this is what people call discard. So if you had nothing else to do with this starter, you could just throw it out. So you could put it down the sink. Just make sure you rinse with real hot water very quickly, because it will solidify and become basically like cement if left to sit. You could throw it out just in your compost, or if you're super into the sourdough and you hate wasting anything, you can actually keep this. It won't have a ton of rising power, but it can be used to add flavor to other recipes. Some people will use it for, I've actually heard one person use it for gravy. I like to use and save mine for crepes. But there's a ton of recipes out there that call for sourdough discard, where they want the flavor from the starter, but not so much the rise from it. So I'm going to take the 60 grams, I'm going to set it aside. I have uses for that later. If you don't, you just toss it. So now we've got our mother starter again, and we need to feed this because we're going to put it back in the fridge for about a week, maybe 2 weeks. And if we were to just throw it back in there, as it were, having taken out those 20 grams, it had eaten up all of its food source. There was nothing left to it. And if you leave the starter past the point of its peak, past when it's absorbed all of the food, which is the flour, it's going to start to break itself down. You're actually going to develop alcohols, what people call hooch, on the top of it. And if left too long, it will essentially kill itself. So that's why I suggest you keep an eye on it every week or two that you do a feeding. So we have 40 grams in here. Same thing like I did to build up that other starter. I'm going to take 40 grams water, add that into my container. Again, just mixing up, dissolving all the starter in the container. So depending on, if you're going to stick to my recipe, I don't use any fancy words, but what some people call this starter that we've prepared for our recipe, they call it a levain. That's one of those words that is sort of misused or used differently by different people, so I'm not 100% sure if that's accurate. That's why I avoid using it. So I just call this starter for bread, and this is my mother starter. So the idea of sourdough is that you always want to be leaving something behind from your original container. You never want to take everything and just dump it out. So you could theoretically just build up within one container, build up as much as you need, make sure that you've made some extra so that when you make your bread the next morning, you're not gonna use everything up. Personally, I have made the mistake a couple times where I've only done it in a single container. I go to make my bread the next morning, and I'm absentmindedly just dumping everything into the bowl that I'm going to make my bread in. And then sort of scrambling to pull a little bit out so that I have some mother left over. So you really only need a tablespoon or two left over, but still, just to avoid accidentally adding it all into one batch, this is what I find easiest, having those two containers. So original starter's all dissolved. I've got another 40 grams flour. So for this one here, I had 40 grams starter, 40 grams water, 40 grams flour. So this is that sort of 1:1:1 ratio. And I generally suggest that you kind of stick to that when you're doing just a regular feeding. So again, just mixing it up till there's no obvious super large clumps. It's going to be quite thick. It's going to be thicker than like pancake batter. And this is a 100% hydration starter, so equal parts water and flour. Different starters, different methods will call for different hydrations, but pretty standard is the 100% one. Now, I wish I had some cool music going over in the background here, or I'd speed everything up, but just so you get an idea for truly how long the process takes, it's about 10, maybe 15 minutes with cleanup. If you're just if you're just feeding the starter, it'll be a little bit quicker. But that's really all it takes, is that sort of 5, maybe 10 minutes every week or two, just to make sure that starter's active. So the reason that you want to be doing that feeding, every week or two, like I said, is because the starter will eventually start to break itself down. The other reason is that you just want to maintain peak activity in that culture. If it's left for too long, while it might not kill the starter because it's in the fridge and the fridge slows everything down, it just will be a little bit sluggish when you go to use it. So if it's been 3, maybe 4 weeks before you've fed your starter and you want to bake on a Saturday morning, what I would suggest is Friday morning you do a cycle of feeding. So you start with your 120 grams, you throw away 80 grams, you feed another 40 and 40, you let that sit for about 8 hours, and then around dinner time or sort of in the evening, you would split some to be used for your levain or your bread starter, and then you would do another feeding of this mother one. And doing those 2 feedings would just make sure that your starter is as active as it possibly could be. So typically my starter will quadruple in volume. There's a few different tests out there that people have for sort of when is your starter ready for use. One is the float test. So you take a teaspoon of the starter, you float it in a bowl of water. My problem with this one is that your starter will float quite early on in the process and well before it's actually reached that full peak maturity. And you want to be using the starter at its peak of maturity because that is when it's most active. As well, that's when you'll get the best flavor from it. If you're using it well before it's reached that peak activity, because the starter is still developing, it's still using up its initial food source, it's just going to be a little bit slow when you add it to bread. Again, not a problem, it's just something, it's another variable to account for, that if you're not sort of well versed in sourdough and all the signs and symptoms and troubleshooting, it might just be a little bit frustrating when you're 3 or 4 folds into the process and you're not really seeing any rise. All right. So I'll take a paper towel and I'll wipe down the sides of the container just so it's a little bit cleaner to see, because I'm OCD like that. But if you can see, we're kind of back at 120 grams and we're roughly at that original line where we started. So usually I use an elastic for my own containers. I've just been sharing so much in bulk and I jostle these containers around in the fridge, so that's why the tape's been easier for me. But that's our mother starter. So what I'm going to do with this now, I'm going to keep the lid on and I'm going to let it sit out for about an hour or 2. What I want to happen is I want to see just a little bit of rise above that initial line, and that just signals to me that there's some activity going on in this mother starter again. I don't want it to go through its full feeding cycle because I want it to still have some food source left so that it doesn't eat itself out when I put it in the fridge over the week. But you do want to make sure that it is active and going before you put it in the fridge. If you're in a huge hurry and you've done this late at night like I usually end up doing, you can take this and put it in the oven with the light on. Just make sure that you warn everybody in the house not to turn the oven on. What I like to do is I'll put a Post-it note across the buttons to turn it on. That way I'm less likely to just absentmindedly turn it on while my mother starter's in there. But I'm going to wait an hour or two just to get a little bit of rise, and then this mother starter is going to go back in the fridge for a week or two. Meanwhile, the levain, or the starter for bread, is going to sit out on the counter, and it's going to be staying out for anywhere between 8 to 12 hours. I'll check on it the next morning, and I'll come back to it, and I'll sort of see where it's at. So like I mentioned before, I want to see it rise up in its container, and it'll get up probably to about here, and then it'll start to fall back down. And that's at the point where I want to start using it. So it's used up the entirety of its food source that was currently in here. The starter is as active as it possibly could be. Everything in this culture is ready to go. That's when I want to be adding it to the bread. So a couple other things that I may have forgotten to mention here. All of the water I was using also room temperature. I keep my house between 70, 72 degrees. I find that's a good comfort level for me, but it's also a good temperature for the sourdough to be rising at. If your house is considerably colder, you may have to use, like I said, the oven with the light on. You just want to make sure that you keep an eye on how hot your oven gets. I know some people's oven lights go crazy warm. You never want to go above 90 degrees with any of this when you're just prepping the starter. Past 90 degrees and you'll actually start killing off the culture. So the sweet spot is kind of 85 degrees if you sort of want to speed things up a little bit. So if you have a thermometer, just stick that in the oven with it so that you're not accidentally making things too hot. But that's the basics of it. That's feeding the sourdough starter. That's prepping some starter for a recipe tomorrow. So the amount of starter that you need for your recipe will vary depending on what recipe you're using. I give you guys all 3 different variations of my recipe. If you were taking out, say, let's say you needed 300 grams of starter from your original container of 120, you could take out 100, add 100 water, add 100 flour, have your 300 grams of starter, and then you'd replenish back to this 20 grams. You'd give it 50 grams water, 50 grams flour. It may take a little bit longer for the mother starter to sort of give you that initial indication of rising, or you could do it the other way, where you could take out less starter from here and have a greater proportion of new water and flour added, so more like a 1 to 2 to 2. It will just take longer to rise. I think a lot of people get hung up on the proportions and the math of everything like that. Sourdough is a process. There's no rushing it. There's no, this works for everybody on this schedule. Everyone's house is a different temperature. Your water might be a slightly different temperature. There's just a whole bunch of variables to it. So patience is key. And you kind of have to play around with it and figure out what works best for you. Like I said, because I don't want to be waking up super early, this one is kind of at a ratio of 1 part starter to 2.5 parts water, 2.5 parts flour. This one we've kept 1 part water, 1 part water, 1 part flour. You can change those variables. When I'm making big batches of starter, I'll go as high as 1 part starter to like 6 parts water, 6 parts flour. It takes a little bit longer for that initial rise period, but the culture will develop and will grow. You need only a tablespoon of starter to make as much as you need from there. It's just a matter of timing yourself accordingly. So if I wanted to wake up at 6 in the morning tomorrow and have my starter ready, I'd stick to a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio. If I want to be a little bit lazier about it and maybe start in the afternoon, I would change the ratios. I know it's a lot of math. If it's too confusing, if you're ever hung up on something, send me a message. I'll help you out with that. But that's the basics of it. You have to feed the mother starter regularly, and you always want to leave some behind. If you have any questions, send me a message. I'm happy to help you guys out. Any comments on the video, let me know as well. I'm trying to use my hands as much as I can, but it just doesn't feel too natural going overboard. But here we are. I hope you guys learned something, / I hope this clarified my recipes a little bit. Happy baking, everybody. Enjoy.